for Energy and the Environment.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the only reason why we're dealing with this MPI today is because the member for Port Adelaide thinks the best form of defence is offence. Because if you had the record that Labor had with energy policy, you would not have the gall to come to this dispatch box. Because when they were last in government, electricity prices increased by more than 100%. We had the dreaded $15 billion carbon tax, which Australians didn't want and Australians didn't need. We had more than a dozen different policies. Who could forget the Citizens' Assembly, the Clash for Clunkers, the Emissions Trading Scheme, the carbon tax, and the list went on. They were very, very poor policies. And then, of course, now, from opposition, they have a quadrilla of policies which are only going to send electricity prices higher and undermine the stability of the system. First and foremost, they have a 50% renewable energy target by 2030. When they put that in their policy document, they said there wouldn't be the details released until October 2017. And then, when the Leader of the Opposition fronted up to the Press Club the other day, it was the issue that didn't get spoken of, but other than a single reference to renewables with no detail about his policy. They have a 45% emissions reduction target by 2030, nearly double what we have taken to Paris, which will cost hundreds of billions of dollars in order to meet. They have an emissions intensity scheme which Penny Wong, the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate when Climate Change Minister in 2009, described as a mongrel of a policy, described it as a smokescreen and described it as having no credible alternative. And then, of course, they have a policy to close Australia's 24 coal-fired power stations. Now, they come up in question time today and ask about the Tomago aluminium smelter, but the Tomago aluminium smelter and others like it would not survive if we didn't have coal-fired power. And what about the member for Shortland? He's a shadow assistant minister, and he has a policy that he has to defend, which includes the forced closure of Vales Point in his own electorate. Mr Speaker, it does. It does. And the Australian Energy Market Commission modelled the forced closure policy, and then the member for Port Adelaide has referred to that. And I tell you, the many hundreds of workers at Vales Point wouldn't be too happy with the member for Shortland. And as Graham Richardson said, Labor is trying to outgreen the Greens. They've got a farce of a policy. It's on a wing, a hope and a prayer. Right? It's a wing, a hope and a prayer, and it's going to sell out pensioners and blue-collar workers, blue-collar workers that you are expected to defend. Now, let's get the record straight as to what occurred in South Australia. We've had 4 blackouts in nearly as many months. 1.7 million people lost power last September. We had blackouts in December, January and now in February. And embarrassingly and humiliatingly, the member for Port Adelaide described those blackouts as mere hiccups. Now, if I was working for one of those companies, one of those 3,000 workers at Olympic Dam in the member for in South Australia, owned by BHP, or I was one of the 1,500 workers at Arium at Whyalla, or was I one of the hundreds of workers at the Port Pirie smelter that is owned by Nearstar, if I was one of those hundreds of workers or thousands of workers that were affected, I wouldn't be describing that as a mere hiccup. Because if I was one of those people who was stuck in an elevator, if I was one of those people who was imprisoned in their homes, if I was one of those people who was stuck in the gridlock of the streets when the lights went out, I would not be describing this as a hiccup. Nor would I be describing the fact that South Australia pays electricity prices which are more than 40% above the average across the national electricity market. I wouldn't be describing that as a headache. I wouldn't be describing that as a headache. So, Mr Speaker, this is the policy that the Labor Party has effectively led to these blackouts, because what they have done is they've left the South Australian system a lot more vulnerable. In fact, since the closure of the Northern Power Station last May, which the Labor Party says has nothing to do with renewables, which was absolutely disagreed with by Alinta in their statement at the time. You've seen nearly a doubling of the reliance on the interconnector, ironically supplying brown coal-fired power from the Latrobe Valley into South Australia. And South Australia has become a lot more vulnerable. You see, the intermittent power that you are now relying on South Australia for more than 40% of supply doesn't always have predictable levels of supply. And the quality as well as the quantity is different from baseload generation, particularly coal, but also gas and hydro. It doesn't have the same characteristics of FCAS and inertia that you get from a spinning turbine and the consistent 50 hertz voltage that you get with baseload power. And one day in the last June-July period last year, wind supplied 80% of South Australia's power. On another day, it supplied just 1% of its power. And when the lights went out last Wednesday, it actually fell to supplying just 2.5% of South Australia's supply. That was a 95% drop on the power that was being supplied by the wind farms earlier in that day. And it's that level of volatility without the necessary storage, which this reliance on intermittent power creates. Now, Mr Speaker, we are taking very seriously our responsibilities to get more stability into the system. That is why we've tasked the Chief Scientist, Alan Finkel, to produce a report, and that's why we are investing record amounts in storage, battery storage, and as the Prime Minister talked about, pumped hydro. Some of the programs include the virtual power plant in Adelaide, connecting 1,000 businesses and homes with batteries and solar PV. The work we're doing on a copper mine in Western Australia in order to take out diesel from that operation and replacing it with solar. The work we're doing in pumped hydro with the Kidston gold mine in Queensland. More than $150 million worth of projects have been invested in by ARENA and CFC with battery technology. Of course, we want to push the states to lift the moratoriums and the bans on gas development, because we think this is vital as a transition fuel with about half the emissions of coal. And we need to get more gas out of the ground. For example, in the Northern Territory now with the Labor government, and they have a moratorium in place, Northern Territory has about 180 years worth of supply to meet Australia's domestic gas needs. Imagine if we could get that out of the ground. The other target we're taking on is the Labor states' high renewable energy targets, which are not only leading to bad investment outcomes but also won't improve the environment. A 50% target in South Australia, a 50% target in Queensland, remarkably with only 4.5% of their power today coming from renewables, and a 40% target in Victoria. I'm very pleased to say at this dispatch box that our Victorian, South Australian and Queensland Liberal and National colleagues have banded together to reject those targets once they get into government. Now, Mr Speaker, we take our emissions reduction targets very seriously, and those on the other side of the House need to know when they were in government, they were projected to miss their 2020 target by more than 700 million tonnes. We, according to the last projections, will beat our 2020 targets by more than 220 million tonnes. Now, Mr Speaker, whether it's energy productivity, whether it's our emissions reduction fund, which has been able to achieve 178 million tonnes of abatement at just over $11 on average, whether it's what we are doing in other parts of the portfolio with the renewable energy target and the work of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation ARENA, we are doing a lot in a lot of areas to meet our emissions targets, and we will beat our 2030 targets as well as beating our 2020 targets. Now, Mr Speaker, I just want to finish by saying that the member for Port Adelaide has been playing a very dangerous game in the last week. He, unfortunately, because he's a very endearing bloke and means well, but unfortunately he has got wrong. He has got wrong and misunderstood the role of AEMO. He has misunderstood the role of AEMO. Secondly, he has misunderstood the true powers of the states to direct AEMO and the lack of the power of the Commonwealth to direct AEMO. Thirdly, he has also sought to blame the government for not saying that the South Australian blackout last September had anything to do with the severe storms. We were upfront at the time. And today at the dispatch box, he also sought to imply that there was load shedding for residential customers. That is not correct, and he knows the truth.